Hello guys, Julia here today for you with a really fun card that I really enjoy doing. I actually made two of them and I'll show you the variations in the end. I am going to be using distress markers. Yes, remember those? Most of us started out with distress markers before we got into those fancy watercolor pens. And I'm using a stamp by Stamping Bella. I'm going to stamp it on watercolor paper using my favorite things, black licorice ink. This ink is fantastic. It works with Copic markers, with watercolors, with colored pencils. It's basically an all-round ink. I really like it. So I'm stamping it down here on some watercolor paper since I'm going to be using basically a watercolor technique, so you need a paper that will work with that. I will be using blender pens, and I have two. I have one from Stampin' Up, and then I have this Dove blender pen. They're basically the same, like they work the same way. This one has this brush tip here. It's a solid brush tip, and this one has a wider tip. I actually had to cut down the tip a bit because it got, I don't know, like fuzzy, so I always have to cut it down a bit. I'm not very happy with the tip, but basically they work the same. You can see here that I put down some color first with my distress marker, and I put down rather a large bit of color, and you can see that you can see the line from where I blended it out. But if you only work in small areas like I do on the rest of the image, you can see that I can blend it out much easier. So my suggestion to you would be, of course, depending on what kind of paper you use, try how large of an area you can color with your marker before blending out, because you don't want to end up with those lines. I'm not worried because I know I'll be adding several layers of color. So I started out with the bear, and now I'm putting a very pale pink into the shadow areas of the thing on his head. And you can see that I'm only putting color where it would be darkest, and I'm trying to leave the areas white, which will be the highlights. Don't worry about this, we'll be darkening this up. And you can see here, this one will have a highlight at the top and then a shadow on the bottom because the light won't hit it there. I know it's really hard to see, but this will just help me to better understand where my shadows will go once I get to the darker colors. So the first layer that I'm applying here everywhere is just the lightest color, just getting a general idea and a feel for the shadows and for the highlights. And while I'm working in different areas, the rest, like the bear, has dried, the color that I put down there. Now I'm coming back with a darker color and adding it into the shadow areas. And you can see that I'm only adding a tiny little bit of color and immediately blending this out with my blender pen to create the darker areas. And I'm really going for strong highlights and shadows. If you are not somebody who wants to have high contrast colors, you can just leave the bear as it is after the first layer of color. There's no need to add several layers unless that is something that you like. So experiment with it a bit and see whatever you like best. But I can really advise to wait until each area is dry before going back, so you will not damage the paper too much. And now I'm putting a darker pink or purple, that's a pink color, into the area that will be darkest on this thing. And you can see that I'm only putting down a little bit of color. I'm not putting down as much color as I used to with the lightest. And I'm blending this out, and whenever you see me take the pen off the screen, I'm wiping it off. I'm wiping the excess color. I was wondering how to pronounce that. I'm wiping the excess color off, so I can blend out the color without darkening up the highlights. And you can see how much dimension I'm immediately getting by adding just a tiny bit of color into those shadow areas and then blending it out. Wiping off the pen, coming back and blending it out. And see, you can already make out the dimension here. So the bear is drying, the thing on his head, on top of his head is drying. So I'm going back into the pillow and I'm working adjacent to areas that have already dried. Distress markers are like a watercolor medium. Remember that, because the colors, if you work next to an area that is wet, the colors will bleed into each other. So if his ear would be wet and you go in with the blue next to it, you would immediately, the colors would immediately start mixing, which you don't want. Now I'm going in with a brownish red color or reddish brown color, depends what you take. I think I will have the colors listed on my blog. And you can see I'm only adding the tiniest amount of color in the shadow areas. And after I had dried this with my heat gun, I'm coming back with a warmer tone because I decided that the darkest brown was a little bit too dark for my taste. And so I gave the bear a little bit more of a warmer tone. Now I'm coming in with the gray. And the gray will help me to darken up the deepest shadow areas without I didn't want to add a purple here because the purple would have looked weird. So I'm just using a gray. And then I'm coming back with the very lightest color that I used in the beginning and go over the highlights a bit just to tint them a little bit, because now the white looks very stark, is a very stark contrast to the dark shadows. So by coming in with the very, very lightest color that I used in the beginning, I'm coloring in the highlights, of course, but it looks more natural with the very, very lightest pink now next to this gray that we used to dark everything up. And you can see just how dimensional this looks. You can see coming back here with the very lightest pink, just adding a little bit of it into the strongest white highlights. Now I was done with the coloring and I used my mini mister that I had filled with perfect pearls and water to spray this to make it shiny, and then I dried this immediately with my heat gun and did the same thing again, and see what you get. Like in real life, it is so sparkly, like literally sparkles like diamonds. Yes, the Twilight fans will get the reference. Sorry, I had to do this. So I die cut this little fella with my my favorite things, mini stitched scalloped circles, and I created a panel here, I have a card base, and I created a watercolor rainbow effect with my Gansai Tambi watercolors and also sprayed it with perfect pearls. And you can see I'm covering that empty spot in the middle, but I went in the order of the color wheel to make sure that the colors would mix nicely. I'm using the Big Hugs by Paper Tray Ink, and I die cut it several times. In the first layer, I actually colored it a bit, so I got a nice gradient from bottom to top. This is how I did that, and this is how it's going to match up eventually. So I stamped it onto the sentiment first, and then I stamped Are the World's Best Medicine onto the card base so I can match that up later. And now I have several die cuts with the word hug, and I die cut them from paper on which I had put double-sided adhesive, so that would make it easier for me to put all of these layers together so they just stick to each other. And I put some foam tape behind my bear when I mounted him on the card. Last but not least, I'm just adding a few enamel dots. You could add sequins, you could add nothing if you want to, but I just wanted to add some enamel dots, something extra glitzy and sparkly, because the person I'm sending this to, this card is actually on the way, or hopefully it has arrived already, is sick, and I figure, you know what, if you're sending it to a sick person, do as much glitter and sparkly stuff as you can, because, you really want to brighten that somebody's day. So here is the second card that I did. It was actually the first one that I did, and I created a little square card base and put the little bear on top of that. And here you can see the finished coloring and the sprinkle and shine and glimmer you get from spraying the bear with the perfect pearls. So that's the entire card that I created. I hope you got inspired, and you're gonna dig around and try to find that blender pen if you have one. Thanks for watching, and see you again soon. Bye bye.